So we typically, I don't think that it's a bad association. We associate reading with having a vast knowledge. But there are many things that are happening in our brain when we read. And one of them is obviously we acquire that content. We acquire the procedural knowledge. We know how to do this process because we know we have read the steps. But reading doesn't only give us that. Reading can give us perspective. Reading can give us empathy. Reading can give us that knowledge that we want, but also it can give us connection. So, for instance, today I was talking with my students about saving the ocean. And we ended up talking about what's happening in Hong Kong and what's happening in Bolivia and what's happening in Chile against those different governments. Yeah. So, how do we make those connections? Only by reading and obviously by watching the news. Yeah. But that is the thing that reading can allow us to do, which is to make these wonderful connections to understand our environment better. In the past, and once again I'm talking not just early 2000s, but previously, even if we can think the moment that we started to evolve and we left the cave, we needed to learn from the environment. We needed to desperately not die, not to go out and feel the warmth of the sand and being attacked by a
wolf or a tiger.
Yes. So what did we do? Well, we start talking to each other and designing better coherent systems so that we could transmit knowledge. Yeah. And eventually we ended up developing several times, not just in a single moment. We developed written systems to actually transmit that kind of information. And as I said before, it is usually just transmitting information. But in doing so, we also were able to develop critical thinking because of all these different skills that we are using when we are reading, which is developing different perspectives, empathy, creativity, etc.
Language is what makes us human. Because of language, we have, of course, communication, we have science, we have math, and so on. You need concentration and you need practice, of course, to be able to read and to write. Because that is why we need to go to school to learn how to read and how to write, but you don't need to have an education to learn to speak, because to be able to speak is something that I would say is innate in our organisms. But we need concentration to be able to write and read, because from an evolutionary point, concentration was something that was useful. Because let's say that you were sleeping in a cave and you heard a noise, so if you ignore that noise because you pretend it was a leaf or a stick, something like that, it could be a lion and it could eat you and you would die. So not being able to concentrate was something useful. Now we don't live in cave, but our brain still have the wire. And that is why when we hear a noise, we look for the noise, because we still have that behavior. That being said, that is why we need to practice to be able to concentrate and to read, because concentration is a skill that you need to develop. So now I would say that we are not doing that because many people want to skim instead of reading, and people are losing concentration because of the internet and because of the technology. So do you think, of course, that would be a problem if we don't acknowledge that could be a major problem in the future?
Yes, because actually what you were describing is how we learn. How are we able to learn that or distinguish what is a leaf versus what is the sound of a predator? And now, what is the difference between events happening in Russia versus events happening in Puerto Rico? So, how do we learn? And one of the fundamental basic skills that we need is attention, which you were calling concentration. What is concentration? Is our brain being attentive and focused on objects, ideas, etc., etc. Why do we need attention? Because only by attending to the stimuli, we're able to get something out of it. Yes. We need to interact with our stimuli so that we can learn. But basically, that is what our brain constantly is seeking, different patterns that allow us to make sense of our environment. And now, unfortunately, we get lots of distractions. The brain is not born to not be distracted. As you said, there are many things that we need to get from the environment so that we avoid being eaten. Yes. And that, although we live in these very comfortable societies, our brain still does not distinguish that from survival. Our brain is one of the organs, is one of the mechanisms that we have. We have evolved not to die and to keep evolving.
Natural selection.
So obviously, learning becomes extremely important for our survival. Once again, society, the development of societies have allowed us to basically pursue more lofty ideas or ideals than rather than just survival. Right. Although there are some societies that have chosen just go for that. Modern societies allow us to basically pursue art, politics, economic growth as humans, and because of language, and I agree totally with you. Thanks to language, we have been able to form cohesive links between different actors in society. Right. So because of that, we have evolved religion, we have education, politics, we have everything that makes us the modern human. Because we can look at human as just a biological machine that needs survival, or we can look at humans as what we like to think of as. We are these moral entities that are like navigating the universe to do something better than just survival. And at the core of that is us being able to keep attention on the stimuli to learn patterns. And unfortunately, many people are saying that the bad use that we are giving technology is basically not allowing us to learn the way we were learning. It's giving us lots of advantages, but also it's giving us some disadvantages at the moment of learning. Because I think that you also mentioned some distinction between knowledge and wisdom. There are certain connections that just by checking a YouTube video, it's not going to give you. But where does wisdom come from? Or where does actually knowledge comes from? From being able to tie together different pieces of information. What do we get through technology? What do we get when we opened our phones and we access YouTube or we access Instagram or any social platform? We get information. Are we getting knowledge out of it? Is a list of procedures knowledge? Does knowing exactly everything that there is to know about the human body give us the knowledge that we need in order to save a person? Give that information to a robot, the robot cannot do anything with it. Give that information to a human, the human can do a lot of things with it.
There is, I read the book Consciousness by Chris Koch, and he argued about that. He said that to be able to duplicate something, that does not mean being. Like maybe a computer can imitate a Mozart piece of music, but that doesn't mean that the computer is feeling what Mozart really felt. I don't know if you agree with what is called the critical period in language, that you have a critical period on when you grow up so that you can learn a language, and if you don't do that by that age, then you don't lose that ability, but it's going to be more difficult. So I would say that now with technology we are influencing that, because now you can see child using iPad and so on. So
yeah, the answer to that can be extremely complex or very, very simple.
Yeah.
I'll try to find a way of discussing this without actually boring you to death, because that is my area of expertise, which is language acquisition, and especially from a cognitive perspective. Yes, I totally agree that language, spoken language specifically, has a critical period. If we are not exposed to spoken language before a certain age, the capacity to learn it easily declines. And actually it declines, typically it's assumed that around 7 it begins to decline. So, which means it's not that you cannot learn to communicate with other humans after age of 7, but it means that crucially during those first years you have to be exposed to spoken language. I don't think that that applies to reading. Reading, as you said, was not evolved in the brain. We are hacking the brain networks to develop the reading skills. Although also from a cognitive perspective, there are people that have isolated particular areas of the brain that specializes in letters. So it seems that there is some learning a language has some wiring consequences on the brain, but it doesn't follow a strict developmental line that the critical age would give you. Why? Because you have 80-year-olds that learn to read. What we do know is that if you don't have a spoken language, if you don't have human language, you cannot learn to read. So reading is writing on a system, that a network, a brain network, that is being used for spoken language. Yeah. So there are some extreme similarities, but also at some point they diverge. One of them is this critical period, that it doesn't seem to be subject to the critical period. So when you are asking how technology is affecting children and they're developing a language, we cannot say that there is a direct line between, or correlation between developing reading skills and the use of technology, but it could be a little bit indirect, because being absorbed by this technology restricts what we do as humans with other humans. It could be that actually we are not developing, or children are not developing, the necessary basis for all the aspects of human language that then we are allowed to hack so that we can develop deeper, or better reading skills. How do we know that, or how I make that inference is that we have dyslexic people. Dyslexic people find it a little bit, find difficult to learn this decoding system that we call reading. And it's something that seems to be related to the brain. There are some studies that they talk that it's some asymmetrical or lack of asymmetry in the brain. And we know that there is something in the brain that doesn't allow that reading development. But these people still have language. So we see how we can decouple spoken language from writing or written language. So once again, I think that basically technology is not affecting our reading skills directly, but it's especially when we're talking about children. I think that probably adults is a completely different story, but it's affecting these more basic
fundamental
skills that basically we need to have completely automatized so that we can access higher level of thinking processes, and so everything that higher levels of thinking processes allow us to do. critical thinking, empathy, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Creation.
And I think this problem is barely new, I would say. Facebook came to the iPhone like in 2010, 2011.
Okay.
And that was
so you're talking about social media.
And that was the peak. Also, I read an article that they found that an anxiety peak in 2011, so they believe that there is a correlation between when the Apple Store came out and anxiety and so on. But that is another topic. Actually, that was the two main topics that we were going to argue today. So thank you very much for being here and for your time. And I hope you find this interesting, and I hope you really learn something.